Lord of the Rings is considered one of the biggest names in fantasy. Many often cite the series as the most influential thing to modern fantasy. It has such a large imprint on literature as a whole, to the point of becoming one of the best-selling books of all time. Many have attempted to adapt it, to capture all of what made Tolkien's grand adventure so special, but very few got very far with it. Even the likes of Stanley Kubrick were interested in tackling the story, but ultimately found that it was unfilmable. It wasn't until the 2000s that the story was given its justice on screen, with Peter Jackson's trilogy of films capturing each of the books to their fullest extent. With their grand scale, powerful visuals, and great acting, they succeed in bringing something that was seen as unfilmable onto the screen with great power. But what if I were to tell you that there was another adaptation of The Lord of the Rings, made 33 years before Peter Jackson got it right? No, I'm not going to talk about Rings of Power or the new animated film. I'm talking about a straight-up adaptation of the first two books came together in an animated film in 1978, just called Lord of the Rings. A rather confusing and strange film that valiantly attempts to create a cohesive experience, but became more of an interesting relic to look back on with its unique visuals and filmmaking prowess than an actual experience of Lord of the Rings. To understand the film a bit better, I feel like it would be best to start with the film's history. Now, the main task of adapting Lord of the Rings was one undertook by many people at the time, including the likes of John Boorman, who created a script, but they ultimately did nothing with that. And so it wasn't until the animation director Ralph Bakshi started pestering the right people to buy that script and the rights and let him make that film. Ralph, at that point, was most well known for his gritty and vulgar, adult-oriented animations with movies like Fritz the Cat and Wizards. It's an odd pairing for sure, but they proceeded with the project anyways, considering his passion for the project and his capabilities as an animator, so they were assured that he was more than capable. So, with the film's $8 million budget, they made the film we have today and all its eccentricity. How does it hold up, though? Well, it certainly has its issues. For one, the film's pacing is just strange. As I mentioned before, it combines the first book, Fellowship of the Ring, and the second book, The Two Towers, into one 2-hour and 10-minute film, which ends up having the pacing feel all over the place, and doesn't give the characters any depth at all. Up until the end of the first book, I'd say it's fine, but as soon as it switches to The Two Towers, it becomes all over the place, tackling the source material at a breakneck pace, making the viewer unsatisfied with the adventure they take, and giving it a conclusion that feels less like a conclusion and more like a setup for a part 2, even though for some reason it decided to end on Helm's Deep. The Rankin Bass production of The Hobbit suffers from the same issue as the second part of this film, where the brisk pace condenses what would otherwise be a compelling story into a synopsis of it. Thankfully, they spared us from the Hobbit songs that punctuate The Hobbit. Like, seriously, there's like 15 of those fucking songs. The acting, or I guess in some cases, the voice acting in the movie is actually pretty well done, and I think does a compelling job of capturing the various denizens of Middle-earth. Each individual is characterized on screen, despite the lack of time with them, and their personality is captured in the vocalization and their movement, but still, the film's pace does not allow us to spend any time with them. These things culminate in an inferior final product to Jackson's trilogy. I can see why today this film is largely forgotten by the Lord of the Rings fandom. It's all over the place visually, and isn't as well put together as the films we would eventually get 30 years later. Yet I am somehow fascinated by it, not because of its performances or its storytelling, but through its various visual styles that create an oddly mesmerizing experience. It uses several disparate methods that give it an odd charm, whether it's the more traditional animation, the rotoscoped live-action footage, or just shots that are blatantly live-action that are slightly tinted and colored over afterwards. This version of Lord of the Rings is an eccentric cornucopia of techniques that make it such an intriguing film, and at the very least it's interesting to look at. The one style I'm the biggest fan of out of all of this is rotoscoping, which is a technique in which live-action footage has drawings traced over live-action actors, something that has been used throughout film history to create animation that is more fluid, expressive, and even lifelike. In this film, it mixes that in with traditional animation to give the action in the film more life, while still giving the characters a whimsical appearance. It's done well, making the story more believable, especially for the audience, considering how campy the appearances would let them have it if they weren't rotoscoped. Looking at various photos and video from behind the scenes really show how goofy the costumes look. Ralph Bakshi himself said as much, specifically saying when asked to do it in live action, he thought it would be tacky. And yeah, I agree. Which is weird for him to say, considering how much of the film splices in live-action footage in between the traditional animation and rotoscoping. As I mentioned before, the animation is undercut with the live action. Even the opening sequence in which we learn about the Rings of Power is done in live action, utilizing shadows to give the backstory this mystique around it, which I think is pretty well done. The added backgrounds pair really well with it in creating this mythology around the story. However, for every great example like that, there are dozens of moments where the film dips into the uncanny valley, sometimes doing so in a swift and abrupt fashion, even clashing with the real animation, like with the Battle of Helm's Deep at the end, where our protagonists are animated, but the incoming forces are not, leading to some janky-looking colored-over film. Yet at the same time, that same technique is used in the Black Rider's chase towards Frodo, and in that instance, it is well done. So that kind of makes it clear on why it was used. At least to me, that makes it clear why it was used. In that instance, in particular, the one with the Black Riders, it creates this otherworldly dissonance between the animated Frodo and the live-action Black Riders. It also helps to portray the dazed state Frodo was in during this chase, psychedelic background images included. The film has dozens of examples like this, both good and bad, that I just find fascinating to watch. Clearly, the technology they used had its limits, considering the budget and the time it was made, yet at the end of the day, these choices were nonetheless interesting to me. I can see why these were made, even if the end result was muddled because of it. Today, it obviously doesn't hold a candle to Peter Jackson's films, but between the 3 decades of this film coming out and Jackson's films coming out, this was all people had for an adaptation. On release, it did well at the box office, earning $30 million off of the $8 million budget it had, but was largely panned by fans of the books and film critics alike. They had most of the issues I spoke of in this video, with how it was paced and how it was haphazardly concluded, although I wouldn't fault its conclusion. Ralph Bakshi planned for a sequel, yet the studio was not invested in the project enough to put money towards it, and so there was never a sequel made. Well, okay, that's not entirely true. Unintentionally, Rankin Bass, the people behind The Hobbit, somehow made one in 1980 with their made-for-TV movie, Return of the King, which is a standalone film that takes the 3rd book because they thought it would be a good idea for some reason just to cut to the end. Again, it's not a sequel to this film, so it's just another strange choice in this series of odd adaptations, especially considering they went straight from The Hobbit to Return of the King, skipping over 2 books entirely. Bakshi never got to complete his version of Lord of the Rings, so now we are left with his incomplete version of it in the form of this movie. Its legacy is a conflicting one, with as many faults as victories. Now it stands as an odd relic of film history, one that braves to be the first in capturing the Fellowship's adventures, and for that, I applaud it. The vision it creates is a unique one, and while I wouldn't recommend it over the Jackson films, I'd say for those truly curious about the film, it is one worth watching, just to see all the interesting choices it has. So check it out if any of what I said is interesting, and I'll see you guys in the next video. Also, why did they have to do my boy Sam dirty like that? Holy shit.
What the hell? Oh my my God, no way, yeah, yeah.